On this day, May 22nd, 1979, Louis Forsdale is being interviewed by Bill Hugg as part of the ECT Foundation Oral History Project. We are being recorded in a studio at Teachers College, Columbia University in the city of New York. Dr. Forsdale is Professor of Communication and Education at Teachers College. His degrees are from Colorado State College at Greeley and from Teachers College. His area of specialization is communication studies. As such, Dr. Forsdale has been involved with the use of audiovisual materials, in the development of communication theory, and in the general development of instructional technology. Of special interest was his personal knowledge of the work of Jim Finn. He knew Finn at Greeley before World War II and worked with him during the war. So first I'd like to ask Dr. Forsdale about the work of Finn during these early years. Second, I would like to ask Lou to comment on his perception as to why 8mm film never seemed to make the impact that he and many others thought it would. And last, I'd like to ask Lou to comment on his perceptions of developments in the field of communication theory and technology, and perhaps comment on some of the contributions of Marshall McLuhan. So let's begin with some of the things that you remember about Jim Finn when you knew him at Greeley.
Okay, this of course could take the entire time because Jim was a fascinating and creative guy. I was born in Greeley and went to high school there, and went to college immediately out of high school, and shortly thereafter met Jim Finn, who was running their audiovisual program. One time Jim told me how he got into that particular slot, since like so many of us in education, in audiovisual education, technology, communication, he didn't begin there at all. I think it's true, at least he so asserted, that he was out of Montana. That I know is true. And that Montana was playing a football game with Colorado State College of Education. And Jim was the drum major. And the president of Colorado State College of Education, George Fraser, became enamored of this great figure out in front of the Montana band, and cornered him a little bit after the game and said, like to have you at Greeley. Whereupon the negotiations proceeded, and Jim finally agreed and came down as their audiovisual man, a field which he developed in his own thinking from scratch, no prior knowledge at all. In some ways, I think Jim was all of his life a drum major. He enjoyed the spotlight. He enjoyed being out in front, leading people. He enjoyed wielding the kind of power that a drum major wields over a band. In many ways, throughout his life, he was not burdened by the doubts that many of us become burdened by. Jim knew that he was right.
Did during these early years his role as a philosopher start to develop?
I think not. I think not. I think his philosopher role began to develop during World War II. During World War II, Jim was at Greeley, as was I, and Jim applied for a commission in the Signal Corps, and was immediately commissioned. Went back to Washington for such basic training as commissioned civilians got, and ended up at the Army's prime graduate school, the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Not knowing that our paths would ever cross again, I meanwhile went into the Air Force as an aviation cadet, ground corps, was trained 9 months at Yale University as a photographer, was sent to California and was sitting at Lemoore Army Air Force Base, which I dare say you've never heard of,
I had an uncle there.
No, you do. Waiting to be sent to the Pacific for the then new B-29 squadrons that were being developed. And one day received a very great shock in the form of an order from the Pentagon to go to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where I was to be assistant in charge of the, as they referred to it, instructional aids program. Jim had located me. It wasn't difficult because the Command and General Staff School had direct telephone line, literally, to the Pentagon and could get any people they wanted. I joined Jim in Leavenworth, and there I'm sure he was beginning to develop his philosophy of instructional materials, as he called it in those days. And then it was one of lending absolute maximum support to those persons on the teaching staff who wanted to use materials. And he had a mighty big staff to do it with, 35 people doing nothing but working on audiovisual materials.
Can you remember some of the more interesting or creative projects that you and Jim worked on during these days? I assume that his staff produced training aids and all kinds of films and film strips and this type of thing.
Yeah, there were some very interesting things that Jim got involved with and that I had the pleasure of helping him carry through. One of the interesting things was that the classrooms that were being used in Leavenworth were huge. I mean, 800 students in a single room. That was the largest classroom probably, down to small classrooms like 200 in a single room. Those classrooms, by the way, were filled with people lowest rank major. You had to be a major to become a student in the Command and General Staff School. One of the things that Jim did was develop standards for visibility of materials that could be seen by 800 people. The person in the last row went up to Washington, to Rochester, to consult with a man named Luckish, who was then the most authoritative person who could be found on what people can see at what distances and so forth. Then went to the commandant of the school and Major General Carl Truesdell and said, Major Truesdell, we've got to set these standards for the material. I'm a captain. I'm teaching the instructors were lieutenant colonels and generals and so forth. How can I do this? And the Major General Truesdell simply issued an order that where audiovisual materials were concerned, Captain Finn was the highest ranking officer on the post. And every every instructor had to have a tryout of material at which one of us would be present to be sure that these minimum standards were met and so forth. Another thing that Jim did that took a mighty lot of pull and power and conviction that he was right, he decided that it would be terribly useful if we had war footage, motion picture footage, on hand in Leavenworth, just raw footage, not cut into films at all. And one of my jobs every week was to go down to Kansas City, Missouri, which was about 30 miles away, 45 revolvers strapped around my waist, not having the slightest idea what I would do with it if push came to shove, accompanied by 2 MPs, and met a military plane that came in every week with duplicate footage of the prime war footage from all theaters, brought it back, and we had 2 men in our units who did nothing but memorize what was in that footage. And then they would go to Colonel so-and-so who was teaching about ponton bridges, new ponton bridges that the Germans were using, and he would say, by the way, I've got 3 minutes of footage that came in last week. I wonder if we couldn't incorporate that. Whereupon the instructor took it upon himself. It was very bad form to say no, because the general was all in favor of backing Jim up on any of these ventures.
I think that's very interesting. Would have applications we could use today if we had those kinds of backup resources. Let's turn now from a discussion of Finn to your experience with 8mm film. I would like you to talk about it from the beginning, as well as how you proceeded to think the development would occur and what actually has happened with the 8mm film thrust.
Well, the beginning of the story is rather strange, and about 1960 or 61, here at Teachers College, the head of the Horace Mann Lincoln Institute for School Research, which is a funded agency at Teachers College, as you know, where monies are available for research by the faculty, came to me, Professor Wells Fauché, came to me and said, I've just learned of the existence of an interesting Japanese projector, which is a cartridge loading projector in 8mm form. I think it has important implications for education. I'm trying to find somebody else who agrees with me on that proposition and who would like to play with it for as long as possible to find out whether it did or not. I saw the drawings of the machine. It wasn't even prototype stage, and said, yeah, this sounds extremely interesting. Half of my time was relieved then for something on the order of 7 years to investigate the possibilities inherent with 8mm film. The basic idea which we had in mind, my colleagues and I who were working on that project in those days, can best be expressed in the phrase, the accessible moving image. We made it very clear to ourselves that we didn't really care in what form that accessible moving image came, as long as it truly was accessible. Accessibility meant for us that a 3-year-old child could use it, and we felt that if a 3-year-old child could use it, that most adult teachers could probably learn then too. We were quite aware of the fact that we were involved in the possibility that television might become the accessible moving image medium, but still 8mm seemed at that moment to have a considerable lead on television. I traipsed around the country to find out what the possibilities were of cartridge loading 16mm projectors, since cartridge loading was very much at the heart of our thinking. Uncovered 3 prototypes of 16mm cartridge loading projectors, and in each instance the cartridge itself cost more money than the film it contained, that is $25 for a cartridge. It developed that in technical terms, power was needed within the cartridge to move 16mm film into a projector. 8mm film, all of the engineers that I talked with agreed, was the only gauge of film, unless one went to 4, was the only gauge of film that could be moved passively through a projector, that is, by action of the claw alone, without any power applied to the cartridge itself. Therefore, the cartridges could be made for 50 cents, something of that kind, and would meet our criterion of the need for inexpensive material. We developed one other thing that we also believed to be true, was that if the moving image was indeed accessible to everybody, child, teacher, housewife, anybody, that it would then come closer to the role that the book has played, and the book has played its role, in large measure at least, because it is accessible. Except, of course, at most college libraries where they've been stolen, but nevertheless, the book is accessible. You can find it, you can carry it around with you, you can look back and forth at it and so forth. You can't do that with film.
Why do you think that it hasn't really made that impact? It isn't a standard item as are books and magazines. What blocked it?
Well, I think there were several things probably. One of them was the very idea of change itself. Schools had by that time geared up to 16 millimeter, although interestingly enough, in the 1920s they'd made the shift from 35 to 16, but not many schools had 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter projectors when that first change was made. By the 60s, large numbers of schools and churches and industrial concerns and so forth for training and educational purposes had 16 millimeter projectors. Even though they weren't using them as much as we thought they could be used, they did have that commitment made. Many libraries, school libraries, county libraries, business libraries and so forth had made commitments to 16 millimeter film. So it was natural for them to turn to 16 millimeter film.
Was the variety of programming available on 8 millimeter as it was in 16 millimeter?
No, it's another major factor that very few people were willing to make the shifts to make 8 millimeter prints available from their 16 millimeter negatives. There was a waiting. Another factor too needs to be brought into account here too. Standards for 8 millimeter projectors were very hard to come by. As a matter of fact, I, for a while, chaired the standards committee for the 8 millimeter portion of the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. The simple fact was that Fairchild had one projector that they began to bring out, which had a different distance between sound and picture than did an MPO projector, which was being brought out. Technicolor at first brought out a silent projector and were headed all in the direction of silent, as they referred to them, single concept films, and only much later brought out sound 8 millimeter equipment. And in the midst of all of this, there then came what was really a rather shattering development on the part of Eastman Kodak, namely the development of Super 8 film, which was incompatible with 8 millimeter film because of sprocket hole size. I was in on the development of Super 8 millimeter film. I remember when Eastman called me up and asked me if I'd like to consult with them. I said, what about? And they said, come on up to Rochester, we'll show you. And they showed me then prototypes of their new Super 8 cartridges in metal, still handmade, hand-tooled prototypes. And said, what do you think about this? Gave me some of their metal cartridges and some of their prototype projectors and said, shall we make this switch? I could only agree with them that they should make the switch for technical reasons. It is a higher quality medium, Super 8, by a good deal than regular 8, but that also stalled the development of the 8 millimeter movement for what are we going to buy? Super 8, regular 8. Nobody knew. And then, of course, finally, one began to see early on in the game, in the late 60s at least, that television was going to present a major opportunity here in the accessible image, even though we are only now beginning to see what is really going to happen in television, probably with discs, ultimately for the distribution of material rather even than the cassettes which are available. Combination of I think, technical factors as well as the normal reluctance of people to change.
Some have said that 8 millimeter simply couldn't compete with 16 millimeter because the quality wasn't good enough for a full class size group, and that teachers were literally hell-bent on showing movies to class size groups. Do you think that might have been a factor also?
It might have been a factor, but I think it was a factor more in people's heads than it was in terms of the actual capability of the film. There's no question that when Super 8 film was introduced, that in quality of resolution and so forth, it was quite as good as 16 millimeter had been 10 years prior. Now, of course, 16 millimeter was increasing its capability at the same time the Super 8 was as well. Grain size was being reduced, sharpness was increasing, and so forth. But if I have seen and did see in the 60s Super 8 millimeter film on 30-foot screens with specially built arc projectors behind them, beautiful, beautiful images. It also involved, however, the development of equipment, and equipment manufacturers really didn't know in what direction to turn. Shall we go cassette? Cassette's got problems because of jamming. Shall we go a slot loading route, which involved all of the intricacies of the ribbon pattern loading and so forth? Or shall we do nothing? Shall we wait? And the confusion was simply too much, I think. Business, of course, and industry, particularly in the sales field, did take up on 8 millimeter on Super 8. They can have built-in obsolescence much more readily than we can. And the portable machine carried by the salesperson is probably the most important thing that 8 millimeter has been used for.
8 millimeter, I suspect, is also used in business and industry and training programs more than in schools. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. There's much business and industry have picked up very much more. I suppose the biggest use in education has not been in distribution, which is what we were after. We were after, as it was John Flory of Eastman Kodak had coined the phrase that 8 millimeter will be the paperback of the film field. He was talking about making hundreds of thousands of prints and distributing them, selling them to schools rather than renting them. $2 a print, something of that kind. A noble vision John had. It's one that never came to pass, also because the laboratories had great difficulty in deciding on which standard to go with what kind of machine. By the way, fascinating little side note on this thing. I don't have any figures on this, but I would be willing to guess that maybe the largest market for Super 8 millimeter distribution in this country is hardcore pornography. And I literally mean that. But the pornographic field, the sales stores have gone in the direction of 8 millimeter and Super 8 millimeter. And from what I gather, their turnover is very, very large indeed.
Well, if we can move from that to maybe some of the things that are on the horizon, and if you could spend a few minutes talking about what you think the future of the field of communication theory and technology is, and I think that can conclude our interview.
Well, of course, you know that you're asking a terribly difficult question. There's no doubt to begin with that in communication technology, we're nowhere near the end of the line. There are a lot of people who think that we are near the end of the line, but if they do believe that, they simply don't know the facts. The fact, for example, that there will be thousands of closed-circuit television channels available, in all probability, the FCC has got to agree to loosen their strictures on this, but the technology is certainly there with lasers and fiberglass optics and so forth, that there will be a tremendous explosion in the electronic communication field. I think the schools can go a couple of ways with respect to that particular explosion. Let's use that as just a for instance. I think we can say we're going to teach things other than those which can be gotten in the home or in libraries and so forth through cable television. And we're going to use the schools for the purpose of face-to-face communication between live people. I suppose more importantly, I think the whole definition of education of who it is who's doing the education is just must change. As Marshall McLuhan has said, and I think accurately, there was a time when more information was passed within the hallways of schools than outside. But that long since is past, that there is more information accessible to more people through television and other means outside of schools than there is inside of schools.
Just in their homes.
Just in their homes. And that will increase. There's no question that that will increase. If a television set is on in the United States 6 hours a day now, not everybody, not the same person watching it all the time, but those are the figures as of about now, school becomes 1/3 of the day. Watching television by somebody becomes 1/3 of the day approximately, and the sleep becomes a part of the day as well. I think we will continue to introduce technology into school systems. What will happen as a result of our current back to basics movement, I think, is an extraordinarily important question to answer in this respect. I also think an extraordinarily important question to answer is the economics of this country and of all nations right now. Obviously, we're in a very, very delicate position, and I don't think in the short run schools are going to be heavily investing in educational technology. Perhaps in the long run they will. I have no doubt, as perhaps a final generalization, that Marshall McLuhan, who has said many foolish things, but who has also said very many profound things, and I think is one of the great philosophers of communication of the 20th century, that the entire relationship of school and the rest of society is now being shifted in ways that will not be turned around by educational technology. Those are my thoughts. I'm a little sorry that they're being preserved on videotape because they'll be dead tomorrow. But
Thank you, Dr. Forsdale.